All right, okay, I'm gonna close this. How's it going, Ajith?
Hello, Benjamin. It's going well.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yep.
So, tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to, what you're doing here. You're a grad student, right, at the moment?
Yeah, right now I'm a grad student in the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I did my undergrad in computer science, linguistics, and cognitive science, and then I work in the learning and language lab as a grad student, master student, where we basically just study language learning and how that, like in children, to see if that can inform us on how to make better deep learning models.
Right. Yeah. And so you got a professor that's kind of interested in this stuff too?
Well, he's interested in language learning and things like that, but I've actually been sort of interested in working on this sort of research about cognition and personality since I started undergrad, actually, because I started doing research with him, and specifically he was asking, this is actually kind of how it started. He asked me to work on this project called Project Humans, where it's basically a multi-agent virtual reality simulation, where he wanted me to sort of think about how you would model cognition and personality. Initially, he wanted me to do it with like trait-based measures.
Right.
I kind of found that like exceedingly difficult to do for something so pure form, like just these like transformative skills in a simulation.
So yeah, we can talk about that. Like trait-based stuff is just averaging out and looking at trends in the population and less looking at an underlying cognition, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like trait-based, it's based on language analysis. So it's just trying to find traits that you can commonly use to describe certain characteristics of people that can be empirically supported and can be backed up with like can be somewhat consistently categorized.
Right. But it sounds more like it's not a causal factor to behavior. It's like a result factor.
Yeah, it's a empirical approach, which naturally leads to like, it is accurate, but since it's not like a rationalist, like you said, causal framework, it's not. It doesn't go down. It doesn't lend itself to like as much predictive power or modeling capabilities. Like,
right, you can't model it like a cognition based off of it.
Yeah, and maybe you could, but right now I'd say the theoretical framework for those trait-based measures is incomplete if you're trying to model it in artificial intelligence.
Right. Yeah. And so you're looking at specifically narratives and how cognition creates narratives?
So what I'm looking at is specifically, one is there's this theory called active inference, which is used in neuroscience and computational neuroscience and also artificial intelligence, and how we can formalize that into sort of this framework that we use, or that the OPS community and that's used in binary cognitive mechanics, things like that, where if we can formalize that using active inference, not only would you be able to model it in just regular multi-agent systems, it gives you like a way, just like a way to model it in artificial intelligence generally. And on top of that, I'm also trying to model it linguistically in narrative. So there's kind of like two different ways I'm approaching this.
So just to unpack that a little bit for our viewers, multi-agent systems are more than one AI interacting with each other.
Yes.
Right.
So
like if you had a group of AIs going through some kind of scenario, you would see how they would get through the scenario based on different personality traits, that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Like, so in the multi-agent scenario, you kind of want to see if they would exhibit traits similar to like, are they actually, how do I explain it? Okay. So in the multi-agent scenario, they are kind of metabolizing information, and this sort of personality framework is based on how the information is being distributed and being metabolized. So that's kind of why this sort of personality framework is useful for modeling in multi-agent simulations. So I just work on formalizing that mathematically using active inference.
Right.
And I'll go more into that in the slides.
Yeah. Let's look at the slides when you're ready.
Yeah.
You also had something. Do you want to tell us a little bit of background before we look at the slides, like about surprise? I think you have some other stuff in there.
Yeah. So I kind of talk about surprisal, and you talked about entropy in a video, which actually really sort of inspired me and kickstarted this. But
right.
Surprisal is just the idea of like how certain or uncertain you are of certain outcomes.
That's right.
So in the context of this, like this will be very clear later, but like sort of when you're describing as OI is lowering the entropy of like the information that you get from your observer function, that's kind of the same thing as minimizing the perplexity or surprisal of your sensory.
Right.
And
so,
this
okay,
is,
let's explain perplexity too for the viewers, because I don't think everyone knows what that is.
Yeah. So perplexity is it's basically the same thing as surprisal, but it's used more in the context of artificial intelligence because you can use it for it's better for like sequences of predictions. So technically, though, higher entropy means higher perplexity. So
right.
the context of this, you could just think of it as the same thing.
So it just kind of maps high entropy to high perplexity. Lower perplexity is low entropy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perplexity, how like perplexed or how surprised. The names are a little intuitive with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, just think of it as like surprisal, perplexity, or just entropy.
Right. So if there was like a really predictable outcome, like you shot a ball the same way at the wall and it came back the exact same way, no perplexity.
Yeah, you'd have a lower perplexity. Maybe like initially, you might be surprised if you never saw a ball bounce back from the wall.
Initially,
then you'd be surprised, and you'd have to
start modeling it.
Yeah, you'd adjust your internal models. Like, a way of thinking about this is like, if you like with the ball example, if you throw a ball at the wall and it bounces back, let's say you don't have any understanding of physics and things like that.
Yeah.
This sort of adjustment you have to make to your internal model based on this outcome that you just happened that surprised you. Now you have to start taking into account collisions and things like that, just like how objects bounce. So
that would be incorporated in your model. Yeah,
exactly.
And so then with multi-agents though, you need to sort of map out each person differently, because you like one person might react drastically different to another person in any given scenario. And so you'd have, like, if you figured out one person, you'd have perplexity with somebody else because they would behave differently. So is that kind of what your models are also tracking? Sort of tracking different individuals?
Yeah, it would be each individual in the multi-agent simulation's perplexity of their sensory inputs. So kind of
like if you gave someone a compliment and they burst out in tears, like it's not something you'd expect.
Yeah, you'd be like, why did that happen? Maybe my compliment wasn't good or things like that. So you adjust your internal sort of representation of that. So what I want to kind of emphasize is this is not just at the high level, it's also at the low level of processing information. So like, for example, in the multi-agent simulation, we start off with just cameras on the heads, and they're trying to take in the sensory inputs in that virtual reality simulation. So it's trying to, once it gets one matrix or sequence, just like a grid of pixels, once it gets that one like grid of pixels, it needs to predict what's the next grid of pixels that's going to happen.
Right.
And as it gets better at doing this, as like we said, it's adjusting its internal models, it starts creating like a hallucination basically of its reality.
And, predicting the next step of every part of reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically that's how transformer models work in a nutshell.
And that's how delusion works.
I'm trying to argue that that's how like the mind works, because if you have that, you can see how sort of the personality traits from the system emerge.
Yeah.
Just at a very low level and a very high level.
And you talk about active inference versus passive inference. You do that as well?
I talk about active inference. I don't talk about passive inference, but active inference is kind of just what we've been describing here.
Right. Yeah. You act and then something reacts. So
Exactly.
so like that I would say in objective personality would map to like blast, right? Whereas the other one is kind of passive inference is kind of consume.
I would say active inference actually takes into account all of the animals, because
Okay.
in active inference, so I never really looked into passive inference, but in active inference, it's more like you're trying to not only minimize the difference between the predicted state, which includes like what would happen if you do an action. So it's
Right.
also trying to predict what happens if I do this action. It doesn't want it to be very surprising what happens next.
Right.
So not only that, but it's also trying to reduce its uncertainty or the entropy
Right.
of,
It's giving it more control over the outcomes in essence.
giving it more control over the outcomes. That's a good way.
Right. But then like so like the other side, the OE side would be more like you would want to shake up your internal framework. Like that's kind of the consume is like, okay, if things get too stagnant and stale, that means I'm gonna get surprised like by accident. So I better surprise myself on purpose, like be curious, try to surprise myself, try to see interesting things, and then update my model preemptively.
Yeah. So this all ties to like kind of like reinforcement learning, like exploration and exploitation. But
Right.
kind of the idea is like there's also this sort of part in the equation, which I'll show on the slide, that is entropy itself that's being subtracted from the KL divergence, which is like the difference between the predicted.
Do you want to start it now?
Sure. Yeah, we can.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Okay.
Okay. So I titled this Computational Psychodynamics because I thought that's a good way of describing what's going on here, kind of where I want this to go research-wise.
Yeah, it sounds like a good title.
Thank you. And sort of kind of like the overview that this is what I present to people in the grad department was just like how this all started. I'm sure like a lot of the viewers here and people are kind of familiar. So it started off with theory of basic human needs and like Jungian psych and OPS. And then we tie in information theory, active inference to this. And this kind of lends itself to like how we would actually sort of use it in the AI models. And then I create behavioral statistical models to basically model the mind and personality. And that's kind of what I say is computational psychodynamics. So,
how does the training work? Like, what kind of, are you going to talk about the environment in the slides, or should we give that background too?
So I'll talk about the narrative training in the slides. When it comes to the multi-agent simulation, it's very theoretical, and also there is like actual multi-agent simulation that's being developed,
right?
Like Project Humans. I don't know how important like that specific training process is.
Yeah,
it's kind of the same. It's kind of similar. Instead of the event representations I used in the narrative, it would just be the sequences of sensory inputs.
Yeah.
So,
just also another kind of just to understand what's going on around your project. So what other types of models being developed and tested to sort of compete with yours, and you're kind of competing using these theories, or?
So in terms of like AI models, or like specifically models we use to model the personality?
Which are the thing that's getting Project Humans.
Okay. Well, Project Humans is kind of just something that's in development in my lab. There are a lot of multi-agent simulations that use transformer models. So all of them can be said to exhibit the same sort of like theory and personality characteristics. So kind of an interesting to think is like almost all AI models would be using the functions.
Right.
So
without being aware of it sometimes.
Yeah. And that's kind of just like, honestly, in my perspective, which I feel like a lot of this sort of kind of gets to is, I think artificial intelligence, humans, animals all use like the same functions. Not all artificial intelligence systems, but the ones in development right now, the ones that are getting popularity right now, are using something akin to this.
Yeah,
Maybe
just coincidentally, sort of thing.
yeah. Maybe they're not in a multi-agent
Explicitly, yeah.
situation, which
Right.
is why you might not see the same sort of behaviors as people, because you do need embodiment. You do need like a multi-agent simulation to really see the same things. But this also kind of lends to like how we think of the mind in general. Like we kind of have to expand what we think of minds, not just in case of like embodiment and simulations, but just like
what's kind of exciting too is to see how AI develops on its own and maybe goes beyond our cognitive models and see if it actually maps onto something more accurate to what's really going on in our minds.
Yeah, like what I found is like through the development of AI historically is a lot of it is the principles that you get from psychodynamics, which is very interesting. Like
even just the concept of neural networks.
Yeah, as we got closer to it, it became like it improved. Like as we got closer, so that was.
Yeah, it's so weird how the extroverts are right. Like you can understand yourself by looking at someone else, and if you're looking at AI, you can understand yourself in an interesting way too. Yeah.
That's kind of why I love
extroverts.
Science and AI. Like, it's just a way of like really trying to engineer the mind from the ground up.
Yeah.
And as a result, you really get a deep understanding of how the mind works.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Yep. So, active inference and uncertainty. So, kind of what active inference is saying is, which we kind of already touched on, is it's trying to minimize the free energy or the difference between the brain's expected sensory inputs and the actual sensory input it receives from the environment. Right. And this is supposed to drive neural activity and learning, things like that. So kind of what I have up here with the gorilla and the people is there was this experiment actually, I think it was actually done in the University of Illinois. Where,
okay, cool.
Huh?
I said, okay, cool. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, basically what this experiment was is they're trying to see how people's attention, like if people actually notice someone in a gorilla suit running by these kids like throwing the ball around. And a lot of people didn't notice the gorilla or person in the gorilla suit. But then when they heard about it and they saw it again, they easily noticed it. So this kind of touches on like the difference between perception, reality, and like what we pay attention to.
Exactly. Attention is the key factor here. Yeah.
Exactly. So like kind of what you have to start thinking about is the attention mechanism itself is what lends to our perception.
Right.
So kind of like with the free energy. So entropy and uncertainty is equivalent to surprisal or perplexity. So it's the mathematical quantity of the overall sort of uncertainty or entropy of the data. So in essence, as the mind's trying to minimize how surprised it is by future sequences of sensory inputs, it's important to know its sequential inputs. So not only are you trying to find hierarchical relationships between the sensory inputs in one sort of timestamp, you're trying to find the relationships between multiple timestamps in a sequence. And we'll see how this is like more important in the future slide. So
sorry to interrupt you with that comment, by the way. I said distracted you.
Interrupt me whenever you can, because like it's good to have.
No, yeah, because we need to break this down for the audience, right? It's kind of
exactly.
High up there.
So as we're trying to minimize this uncertainty, you can kind of think of it as we're developing a statistical model of the relationships and the causes of the sequences of inputs.
So like the ideal is if there's no surprise at all, then you have a completely accurate model of reality inside of the computational model.
Exactly.
And there's the computational model should always expect some kind of surprise, like within limits, like it's right. And it's just, and the learning comes in when the surprise is way out left field sort of thing. Like,
Yeah.
so there's like a metric to tell it when like how much surprise it's getting. Right?
Yeah, there's a very definable mathematical quantity and metric that you can measure to show how surprised it was. And in neuroscience, they
it's
actually
called the surprise function, right?
Yeah, the surprisal function or perplexity.
Right.
And in neuroscience, actually, this is an interesting sort of thing that people did was they simulated a game of Pong using these concepts with actual neurons, and they're able to basically get it to minimize its free energy in order to play a game of Pong. And it was able to do this much faster than digital equivalents because the mind and the brain, or neurons specifically, use an analog equivalent instead of a digital equivalent.
Right.
And when you think of an analog equivalent, it's much more efficient. So analog and digital, for everyone, like analog, kind of like, instead of trying to discretize it, it's a little bit more continuous.
Yeah.
So the analog equivalent is more efficient. However, it is more lossy than a digital equivalent. So there are like trade-offs. But when you see all these huge large language models, you can kind of see like, why is it so large and only able to do, well, it's able to do a lot of things we can't do, but we can also do a lot of things for a lot less power and much more efficiently because we can do it analog.
Right.
Also,
I'm thinking of like a magic show too, that like how much surprise, like you ever see you just do a little coin trick for those little monkeys in the cages and how surprised they are and how they just
they react. I love watching those videos of
right. So it's like if you did magic tricks for your model, it would really screw up your data.
It would have to it would really want to figure out, because that would be a really bad thing for it. In context of the model. It really doesn't want to be surprised.
That's right.
So kind of that's kind of active inference and uncertainty. So kind of what this lends to is I kind of go into like what in this multi-agent simulation, at least in the context of that, but also just kind of what this sort of framework implies in terms of Jungian psych is what is like archetypes, generational knowledge, and qualia in the hard problem of consciousness, specifically in this context. So kind of what...
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about too, like generational knowledge, information in general that's getting passed on from teacher to student, that kind of thing. How that survives by being a good predictor, so it survives. I mean, I guess with humans, it's more about survival than predictiveness, but I guess they sort of overlap as well.
Yeah, because like if you can't predict your environment, there's no way you're going to be able to survive in that environment. So it's kind of like, not only are you trying to maintain this statistical representation, so in this, the mind is creating a statistical model. What I really want to emphasize is that statistical model is the perception in this framework. It is what you're seeing and you're experiencing and yourself and embodiment.
But so like I'll bring up a few things like quantum physics, for example, isn't necessarily needed for survival. So like the reinforcement of it is the fact that it can predict reality, right? Not necessarily survival. And then there's other things like I don't know, astrology, for example, might actually predict in some cases, and then that'll get reinforced in our generational knowledge.
Yeah, like I do definitely think like the way this kind of lends to is you have to start thinking of not just this statistical model as something that individuals develop, but it's something that was developed by the collective and all of life, all the way towards like the genesis of life itself. Like,
but like if there was like one shark attack at the beach or something, and then everybody would gather together, so that fear of that shark attack that probably would never ever happen again would sort of coalesce humans. And so it's even so that knowledge is even beneficial for survival, even though it's not accurate to reality.
Yeah, like
I don't know, it's a shitty example, but it's like they don't always overlap, I'm thinking, but
like
generally,
reality and like
right.
we actually, yeah, exactly. And like
What's beneficial for us versus what's actually predictive.
exactly. And like this gets very nuanced, and that's kind of why I really like Jungian theory and psych, because this is what they're kind of exploring, is kind of like that sort of how we make it compatible, or how we coincide those differences between like reality and sort of the statistical model we're developing over time and generations, and
Yeah.
our genetic history. So
Yeah, because it's funny thinking back at some of humans' beliefs in ancient history, how wrong they were, but how they sort of helped them survive in some way.
yeah,
Like,
and it makes sense in that context, because it's like
right.
we believe these things to sort of understand our world and help us survive, but also
They
pass
give
down.
us an illusion of control sometimes, even like if you pray to like the sea god and you make it across the sea, like it gives you some kind of illusion that you can actually do something sometimes.
Yeah, and like perhaps like when you
Placebo effect,
pray
calming.
and really believe, like a lot of those things would probably help you actually survive that voyage. And
Right. It reduces the fear.
yeah, like,
Right.
and kind of an interesting thing that Carl Jung was like studying is these common patterns and themes that you find across cultures, even if those cultures had little to no
Right.
context.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what is
Yeah.
this
The
actually?
famous one is like the fear of the snake
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah.
So it's actually things that lend itself to understanding the human experience, is kind
Yeah.
of the idea. And so you can kind of see all of those patterns from a very cognitive science perspective.
Yeah. It's interesting to think how AI would develop differently. What kind of,
Yeah, like the archetypes for AI are going to be a lot different than the
right.
archetypes for people.
That's
Uh,
right.
and kind of what I want to touch on in this, what archetypes and generational knowledge is, like what qualia and archetypes would be in this context would be the hierarchical relationships between sensory inputs over time. So time is very important in this. Like it's the relationships of those inputs over time, and these
Okay.
relationships is sort of what an archetype would be in this system, and what qualia would be also.
Do you have something to in AI to model neuroplasticity, like how quickly something learns? Because like if it's just a one-off surprise, you don't really need to go all in on learning that and incorporating that. Or
There is learning rate, which is actually I didn't add it in the slides here, but I was like seeing that as kind of like masculine intuition and feminine sensory versus the opposite
right, yeah, yeah,
is
exactly.
learning rate. So like masculine and feminine concepts I saw is like the differences in learning rates. So if you have a high learning rate, you can almost think of that as
High neuroplasticity, yeah.
high neuroplasticity. Their intuition is very flexible and bendy and movie.
Yeah.
So feminine intuition is what I would guess there. And if you have a low learning rate, it means they're less likely to change their beliefs and take in new information and have that change their intuition. So this can probably see
Yeah.
itself as more masculine sensory, and or no, masculine intuition and feminine sensory would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
I wonder, like, are you doing all beta or gamma quadra, or you're trying to diversify the quadra? Because like you're saying the sensory here.
yeah, I'm still not sure exactly how it would model to. I'm sure there is like an equivalent for the decider functions. I'm not sure if that's
Right.
what you're asking, like masculine and feminine for the decider functions, but
I'm saying like it sounds like you're doing NISE for the most part.
yeah, it would be NISE, but it's also well, it's more like OI.
Oh, okay, just general. Yeah.
It's just general,
Yeah.
because when we talk about sensory and intuitive information in the context of Jungian psych, it's a little different, because sensory information when you think of it as like what people are seeing and stuff, in the context of this is technically also intuitive information because it's still these meta representations and these sort of connections and patterns that you're actually viewing that get hierarchically placed to become like both sensory and intuitive information.
So I'm wondering, maybe one of the sources of that is where is the surprise coming from? Like, what's the comparison coming from? Is it comparing like an intuitive thing, or is it comparing a sensory thing on the output? Because like a prediction for the future could be a bunch of possible sensory things, and as long as there's one of them, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or a bunch of possible intuitive connections with a single sensory.
It's a bunch of possible intuitive connections with a single
sensory
input each time.
Interesting. Okay.
But those intuitive connections are actually trying to model those sensory inputs over time.
Right.
So, yeah. So.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, kind of like what I want to emphasize here is like the experience. It's trying to predict the information of experience. So these sensory inputs over time. So it's like sensations over time, which is what you can kind of think of as experience. Right. So this information of experience that's becoming, that's like hierarchically ordered is like our internal representation.
So like if it's trying to reduce perplexity, right? Mm-hmm. Like the best way to do that for a neural model is just go in a corner and stare at the corner because nothing's going to change, right?
Yes, that is technically true, which is why like sort of this information metabolism concept kind of came in, where you do need to increase your uncertainty about things, which is kind of where like consume comes. And I'll go more into that in like a little bit, but kind of like the experience of seeing the color red is actually informed by the experiences of our ancestors of seeing the color red, including animals and like things that go all the way down in our genetic lineage.
Sure.
So that's kind of an interesting conclusion you arrive from if you could model these Jungian personality functions in AI and also just people.
And the physical body also has to adapt to it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there is like color blindness, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And like this, if you think about it, like the information that's making up our qualia is actually information that's coming from like so many different like sources and things like that, like the literal bits of
like the interpretation level maybe, right? But then the actual sensory level, we are sensory capable of getting red. It's just how do we interpret red?
Yeah, that's true. Like the morphology of our brain is changing with the genetic like algorithm basically, and sort of the information that's encoded in that morphology is being passed down. And kind of the way I kind of see it is like
I think like the other thing is like some of it might not all be true 100%, because I've seen stuff with the brain where like you can just put a microchip on the brain and the brain will automatically connect to the microchip and interpret whatever information is coming in on that microchip.
There's actually a lot of studies now where they're using MRI data, like seeing the MRI, and then they can actually recreate what people are visualizing semantically, and also their inner monologue.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting too. Yeah, because they're getting words on the screen from that. Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, the one that was interesting about the microchip is like they connected these rat brains in a petri dish to a flight simulator, and they just had them properly do flight simulator from feedback. Yeah.
Interesting that rats can fly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like it's not rats, but it's the neurons of rats that were growing on top of this petri dish, on top of this microchip that interfaced with the flight simulator.
Yeah,
just take them out of cold storage and plug them into a flight simulator, and just they would fly eventually after training.
That's interesting because like then it's like rats probably never learned how to fly like anything.
Right. Well, it's not even really a rat. It's like just neurons on a petri dish that from rat DNA that grew.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even a rat brain.
Well, if you think of like since the fact that like AIs are trying to do this, minimize their perplexity, and all animals really, all sentient behavior needs to just minimize perplexity, the sort of actual structure and thing of an individual neuron might not have to really change that much. If
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's general AI, right? That's the dream. It's
Yeah.
like doesn't matter. You could connect it to whatever microchip you want, and it'll still get the correct interpretation of what's going on there and figure out its world.
That's true. That's like, yeah. What we're trying to do with AI is like make it more multimodal, because
right.
for a long time it's just been very specific tasks. But
that's right.
That's more of an issue. I wouldn't say it's an issue with the algorithm, because when the transformer model came out, it kind of it changed the whole field of artificial intelligence, and it didn't come out that long ago. It came out relatively recently by
right. Well, also computers weren't able to do the calculations needed either until recently. So
yeah, there's also a lot of like developments there. But what's interesting is the transformer model. We realize it can do pretty much most of the things we'd ever want to do with AI.
Right.
And all it really is just a self-attention mechanism that can take inputs over very long sequences, and not have like the issue of when you're going through a sequence and you need to pay attention to a really distant input. Sometimes you'll start forgetting.
It'll forget. Yeah, it'll forget it. Yeah.
And there's like vanishing and exploding gradients and things like that, which are addressed by the transformer model. But really, in essence, is just trying to minimize its perplexity. And
yeah, I mean, that is a good essence. Yeah.
Basically, yep. So kind of why I kind of titled this Computational Psychodynamics is there's actually a very interesting thing about active inference is it's a principle of least action, which kind of means that it lends itself to saying that it has more predictive power than you'd expect. So in Lagrangian mechanics, kind of brief overview. I'm not a physicist, but Lagrangian mechanics, basically you're trying to take the integral over the expected differences of different quantities of energy. And as you do this, you can actually reformulate a lot of physics and mechanics using Lagrangian mechanics, where you're just using these quantities of energy. You don't need vectors, you don't need things like that, and you can sort of
the equations of motion come out of it afterwards from this idea of
of the action, or like kind of the effort that some thing is doing.
It's also a very fundamental law of the universe that things go through some kind of least action.
Exactly.
Like light takes the quickest path to go to where it wants to go and stuff like that.
Yeah, like I think like the first sort of inkling was like Heron of Alexandria looking at how light bends and changes, and he was like, how come this takes like a certain path? And then from that
it's counterintuitive to say least action applies to the light. That's what controls the light, but it is actually how it ends up working.
Which is very interesting, and it's like goes down to like sort of a lot of the symmetries of the universe and things like that. But basically, in the context of behavior, if you're trying to basically get an inference of how the free energy is changing over time, you can kind of think of that as sort of the equivalent of the Lagrangian for behavior. So that's kind of the idea there.
That's what always surprised me about like Rube Goldberg machines, for example. That's just not least action. This is like the most convoluted way you could do any task is through this long chain of events that has nothing to do with the task itself.
Yeah, that's true. And I never really thought about that. But
anyway.
But yeah, like kind of what we're trying to do is, or what I want to do ideally in the future of this research, is I want computational psychodynamics to be a sort of physics of consciousness, or a way of creating equations and things like that, where equivalently where Lagrangian mechanics can reformulate the kinematics and equations of mechanics, I want to start creating derivations that are similar, but for behavior.
Behavior, yeah. Yeah.
And like honestly how the mind's processing information. So I see like a lot of potential applications in brain computer interface technology,
Right.
things like that, where you really need to know how information is being metabolized by the brain.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it does feel like that's kind of what humans are doing, and we have like the only way we can grow or the only way we can develop as people is get shaken out of that least action mode that we're always in.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like that's kind of what the voids are. Is like you don't see that you need to be doing something, and it comes and it hits you and has a negative effect.
Yeah.
And through that process, you learn, okay, now I need to start doing least action, at least aiming for least action in this area of my life.
Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, that's kind of the idea behind why I'm trying to connect Lagrangian mechanics. We're kind of trying to do something similar using active inference. So, I kind of already touched on the slide, but basically, if we're trying to measure like positive and negative changes in that information in bits, that should lend itself to predictive power over behavior in theory. So how do we actually get these inferences? Well, that's where OPS and binary cognitive mechanics actually comes in very, very well, because each of those things is sort of an inference of how, well, it's an inference on the motivation behind an action. So it might not be specifically at that very instance that the information is changing, but it is kind of telling you something about how the information is changing in the mind. So what I found is trying to model like each animal is an inference of how the perplexity is changing for that agent in a very broad sense.
What's interesting about this too is you don't have to know exactly how each animal works completely. You can just sort of have this general understanding, and then it does it on its own, right? It produces the effects of that animal on its own. Exactly. And so like even if our definitions of those animals are off, like it'll redefine itself. Yeah. We don't need to use those definitions. Yeah.
Like and I'll go into like very like clear-cut active inference mathematical definitions for each of the animals and I believe in the next few slides.
Okay.
It's
how you're personally interpreting it for the model, right?
For the model and under the active inference framework. Right. But basically what's very interesting is like you said, you actually just see these things emerge. You don't have to really even do anything to change these AI systems. It's just doing it in itself if it's inside a multi environment.
Yeah, it's like you're creating 4 active systems that can modulate between. Like you're giving it 4 tools, and then it's going to optimize each of those tools, right?
Yeah, and it's just like it's just basically
separately.
The best way to describe it is just information metabolism and distributing that information. So then you can sustain that statistical model, but for all of the agents. There's in the paper that I'm writing right now, I talk about hive minds and different types of minds, not just human minds and AI minds, but hive minds too. Like active inference is used to look at ant colony behavior.
Right.
And what you see there is it is very much like the whole colony is trying to maintain this large scale collective statistical model.
Yeah.
In other
it's really
words,
fascinating looking at that stuff, how like very simple behaviors in each individual agent can build up to complex behaviors on a hive's level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like to me, that's very intuitive as the collective consciousness itself.
Right.
Like you think about it like that overarching statistical model that all of these agents are trying to minimize the uncertainty of and really when you say minimize the uncertainty, I literally mean like changing the entropy so then bits of information is basically flowing into that large scale statistical model. And
Right.
you're
And
just trying
being
to
processed by the collective rather
yeah.
than the individual. Yeah.
And for the ants at least, and for people to an extent, maintaining that large scale statistical model is more important than their individual life. Like
Also like birds that fly in the V patterns, that's also sort of that kind of behavior as well emerging.
Yeah.
Like no individual agent needs to know how all the other birds fly. It just has to know how it flies in relation to where it's at, and then the behavior emerges.
And kind of what I really want to like emphasize is because like it's more important than maintaining the self itself for some of these like hive mind, more so like ants and animals like that, but also humans to an extent, is when we think of what's like the driving force of evolution. We say it's we need to maintain ourselves so then we can reproduce, right? Well,
Right.
I would say it's more so actually trying to maintain this large scale statistical model is kind of the driving force of the evolution of some systems. Like
it's DNA survival from like Richard Dawkins' point of view. It's whatever most likely promotes DNA, and that's why you get things like, that's what he was saying, you get things like cooperation and stuff like that.
Exactly.
And communities, because what's important is the DNA survival, not the
The
individual.
DNA, also collective knowledge, like history, things like that. All of these are things that is part of that large scale statistical model.
Right.
So when I say it's qualia, I mean it's the collective qualia and archetypes of all of the agents, which is all part of that like collective consciousness or that large statistical model.
Well, I mean, once this stuff gets good enough too, you could sort of see civilizations grow from scratch and see how they compare to each other.
Yeah.
Like how the information and the memes, I guess, maintain themselves, and which memes are convergent, meaning like they develop separately in different kinds of things, which is kind of what Jung was doing between different civilizations.
Stanford actually released this, it's called Using GPT for Human-like Simulacra, I believe is the title. But in that, you can see like these agents, and they actually develop like a history and things like that, to like, you see like these very emergent behaviors where they like are sending, it's like a very closed system in that situation. But you see like them developing generational knowledge, which is very interesting.
And that's useful too for like obviously new entities. Like in humans, you have to teach people over years, like kids over years, how to walk. But like in AI, you don't necessarily have to do that for each agent. If you have some kind of intergenerational thing, you can just pass on walking knowledge like that for AI, pass on mathematics knowledge like that. As soon as one develops it, so that's kind of what you're doing, is like showing how information can spread and be used widely once one agent figures it out.
Yeah, and like I do think that there's actually benefits and deficits for the differences there. Like for humans, the fact that we have to pass on this knowledge and there's like this cycle of life and death, it actually lends itself to sort of verifying that knowledge.
Verifying, and innovating new knowledge, new ways.
And making sure it's all TI'd and very like correct.
100%.
Because knowledge that's not correct, if passed down, is not going to survive. So it kind of filters out that knowledge.
Right. Yeah, there's a pro and a con, and then the con, like the pro of the other one is you at least have somewhere to start. Like, okay, I'll accept what I learned from school, and I can use that and develop it and grow it further. Right. Even though it might be worth it just to scrap it and develop a new one. So like those agents that can pass on that knowledge immediately could pass on false knowledge and things like that. Which so it'd be interesting to sort of model the different kinds of knowledge acquiring within your AI community. Like some of them will inherit the knowledge, and other people will have to develop themselves and then challenge the existing knowledge because they've developed something that's better or new or whatever.
Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Oh, I did? Okay. What was I saying? yeah, so like it'd be interesting to have that collective
Yeah.
knowledge, and then the independent agents that have to develop the knowledge on their own versus in different, like that's what I'm thinking the functions are doing as well, is like, okay, any SI, okay, they're inheriting one type of information and developing the other one from scratch, whereas the other ones are doing the opposite, and then seeing if they meet in the middle somewhere. It's like, okay, I reinvented the wheel. Does that match society's invention of the wheel? Yes or
Yeah.
no? Right.
Like that's true. And honestly, like that's kind of where my interests lie, is like using these principles that we get from this to develop better or new innovative, it might not even be better, but just like new AI systems.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because I find this very like useful and helpful actually to doing that. So now each sort of function in like an active inference sort of framework. So sleep or revising would be minimizing perplexity for the self. So any behavior that's trying to make the world more predictable or understandable for the agent. So
That's where the looking in the corner comes in.
yeah, looking in the corner, technically, like if you think about it, like a very sleep intense or sleep first AI might just do that. Like,
right. Right.
Which is kind of funny, but yeah. So like studying for a test, you're trying to reduce the uncertainty, a very predictable structure for the day, using a map or a GPS could reduce uncertainty. Basically, really processing that information and reducing that perplexity. It's kind of like lowering the entropy of that, which you described in your entropy video. And it could be represented by this equation, which is basically A, which is the action. The action that the agent chooses is minimization of the difference between the beliefs about the world it already thinks it has and what it expects to get from doing a certain action. And then you subtract entropy. You're not actually like subtracting it. It's trying to minimize this. It's trying to minimize the KL divergence, which is
what this looks like? This looks really similar to feedback systems and control systems. I don't know if you've studied that at all. Yeah.
I have not, but it doesn't surprise me because
see the old version of AI is control systems. It's like human developed and human equations to make to bring balance to a system that is otherwise imbalanced.
Yeah.
And it's just a way to engineer AI based on analog stuff, even from old days. And like a lot of engineering projects are still using, most of them actually are still using that because they don't really understand AI yet as a powerful tool. So like missile guidance systems and things like that are still using control systems to know when they're on target. It's just like human engineered.
Yeah.
But yeah, it looks like that. Like you do have a feedback to check if you're on target. Constantly want to check if you're on target and adjust based on the difference, like how far off target you are.
Yeah, and like kind of a lot of this is like very base information theory. So I'm guessing like a lot of those control systems, you definitely need to use information theory.
Right.
To, adjust and make it so it can actually work and things like that for whatever situation you're trying to use it for. So yeah, KL or Kullback-Leibler divergence is basically what its existing model, what it thinks will happen if it does a certain action, and the difference between that, between what actually ends up like happening. It's trying to just minimize that difference and also minimize uncertainty about the hidden states of the world, basically. And this is kind of
so what's interesting in control functions is there's three heuristics that it looks at. There's the differential, which is like this, like it's a proportional multiplier based on how far off it is.
Yeah.
Then there's the integral. It's over time.
Yeah.
So it's sort of yeah, and PID. So integral and differential, and what's the P? I forget. But yeah, like it's looking at three heuristics to sort of modify that and get as close to a controlled curve as you can for your outcomes.
Yeah, like I like that. It's like used in a very well.
Right.
I used to think like, Jungian psych is just trying to make cognition into systems, and like you're describing control
Right.
systems. So it's,
Yeah. So like when you were talking before about memory, like the memory of certain key pieces of information that might be useful later. That's
Yeah.
kind of what the integral side is looking at, is like over long periods of time, how do I regulate this kind of thing?
yeah.
Yeah. Proportional, integral, and differential. Yeah, those are the three: proportional, integral, and differential.
Sounds very interesting. I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, whatever. Just side info here.
Yeah.
Don't want to steal your show.
So basically, you're trying to minimize like that difference, and as a result, you get a certain action. And then blast and directing, very similar equation. So yeah, minimizing perplexity for other agents. So when an agent's trying to minimize the perplexity for other agents, is trying to make the world more predictable for them. This might be like communicating or guiding and giving them clear instructions.
Right. So what's interesting about your model is this translates to actual narratives. And so you can actually see these behaviors in a narrative, in a predictive text sort of thing, right?
Yeah, we'll get there. Like,
okay,
how we actually.
All right, I keep stopping you. Let's go.
It's all good. It's helping me get my thoughts in order.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, you're trying to minimize the difference between like what you're predicting and your actual sort of states of the world given an action, and the entropy, but for other agents. And like I add that as like Q prime and S prime, and then G prime is like the generative model for other agents. And still A is the action that agent picks at that certain timestamp. So then consume and seeking, similar thing. You're maximizing the perplexity for the self. So you need to find novelty and uncertainty, exploring new environments. So this one, there is like some sort of uncertainty here, because like technically with exploration and exploitation, the agents are still trying to minimize perplexity in the long run.
Right.
But
maximize it in the short run.
Maximize it in the short run. So
that's exactly what I was seeing with consume as well. Yep.
Yeah. Here it's we just say argmax. Technically you are trying to minimize perplexity over the long run. So this wouldn't be exactly how someone who's like very into active inference would be like, wait, that's not like, you're never trying to maximize it. But
that's right.
Like, hear me out. For this case, for this specific action, it's increasing the perplexity. So,
yeah. So it's like exposing yourself to new experiences, to new situations, to new things like that, so that you can build models of it. Because you won't have a model of something you're not observing or you're not interacting with.
Exactly. Like if they were actually just trying to increase their perplexity, they would just die. Or like, I don't know.
So like this kind of gets the person out of looking at the corner and starts getting them to develop more and more models for different situations, because you never know when you're going to be dropped out of an airplane and have to
and like in RL with active inference, just as a whole, you don't really need to change the equation to argmax to get exploration because of the entropy term, which is like a little complicated, but like but basically for this context and modeling it with AI, I include the maximization of this just for each action individually. So that's just kind of there.
Okay. And so do you have the AI go through during the day different animals so that it's updating itself, narrowing itself down, doing everything that it needs to do?
So
pass on information to other agents.
Oh yeah. If I was going to model this with AI, I would have a statistical model that predicts when they would do an action like this. So it would be like going through it, and each one would be like how they transition between each of these states.
Because like for me personally, I feel that big consume pull when things just get too stagnant and boring. It's like, okay, now I need to go and shake things up. I need to learn something.
Yeah.
Because everything's too predictable.
That makes sense. Like, yeah, it would be like how they're transitioning. You would be more likely to transition to this state than other people if we're making a statistical model like
or the threshold would be lower. Like, okay, it's like for me, it's stable enough and predictable enough, but for someone else, it might not be predictable enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Like it's
They
kind
would
of
only jump into consume at a lower threshold.
yeah. It's like
Right.
yeah, their thresholds basically, and their preferences for what kind of states they would want to be in, and like what they're okay with in terms of like their model of reality, basically. And then
Cool.
play and conferring, same thing, but you're trying to maximize the perplexity for others. It's like introducing uncertainty, challenge into the world. Like you could be trying to confuse or mislead or challenge others to stimulate learning and growth. So it's
Right.
still
So
overall,
just very clearly, this isn't the definition of play or conferring for our cognition. It's
yeah.
what the model is doing.
Yes, it's the equivalent of play and conferring, but for AI.
But for AI, yeah.
And actually, it's not just AI. It's like general sentient behavior under active inference.
Right.
So very generalized.
And again, your interpretation of it for AI. Yeah.
Yeah. So maximizing perplexity, it's still done in order to minimize the perplexity in the long run for everyone.
Right.
But similar to like the consume and seeking.
Right.
But
so this should really shake people out of their corner more than anything else. Like if you have an agent looking at it in its corner, it's just happy. So someone with a high play will just sort of disrupt their corner.
Yeah,
and
like
make them have to adapt to reality in some way.
So like the play first agent will see that agent that's like sitting in the corner and be like
Okay,
stimulate it and
you're
like
in trouble. Yeah. We'll
and
save you.
it's very useful for what this goes very well into the human values, like
Right.
the theory of human values. It's like those are sort of the human values. Like you need to stimulate growth and learning, and not just for yourself, but for the whole community, things like that.
Right.
And yeah, it's very tied together. So yeah, introducing confusion, misdirection, like a magician or like a coach introducing or a teacher introducing like a hard, challenging problem or a drill to like really make it so they're struggling, but it's for a good reason.
Right.
Like it's to push them to learn and improve.
And so we'll get into this, but like you do have results from defining these in this way on an AI level.
Technically the results, like I didn't even have to get the results specifically for the AIs because under the active inference framework, a lot of people have already done sort of simulations and things like that. So kind of the interesting thing is when I was coming across this is I found, a lot of the work was already done. And technically, if I was doing this with Project Humans, you would expect to see similar results. And
cool.
There's things I tie into the paper where
so
people
it's like convergent. It's convergent. Information. Yeah.
Exactly. Like people
they're doing it anyways without even knowing OP.
Exactly. Like people tied in Jungian psych, or people didn't even know about Jungian psych, but Jungian psych
or entropy on Jungian psych.
already came up with active inference before active inference was a thing.
Right.
Which is very interesting. And like I don't know, to me that lends more to the validity is the
validity of the theory.
Yeah. Is that like we were able to get to it from multiple directions. Like you can get it through active inference, predictive processing, so many different like theories in neuroscience, cognitive psych, and personality theory that just converges onto this basically.
Yay, confirmation bias. Exciting.
Yes. But yeah, like I didn't even know about active inference or things like that when I was like learning about the entropy theory. And then I discovered this and I'm like, oh, it already exists.
It already exists. There you go.
Yeah. So that was
really cool. It's just grounded in a different way.
Yeah, it's grounded in a different way. And grounded in a different way. And it's formalized in a different way. So it's very interesting. So
just
now
to interact with the audience for a second, it seems like play could disrupt directly or indirectly, maybe make a change to the environment that forces the agent out of the corner.
Yeah, I agree. Like, stimulate that learning and growth, basically.
Yeah.
And now I'll get into how we tie this into AI with narratives. And what I want people to think is it's not just narratives. Sort of this kind of generalizes to AI in general if you start using different types of data, basically. So, and this is another thing that I thought I figured out on my own, but then this is why you need to consume.
Yeah.
This is why you need to consume, because I thought I came up with this really great algorithm to do this, but then I find that it already exists in like 2017.
Yeah. It's what we were talking about before, like getting the knowledge from the collective versus developing it yourself.
Yeah.
This happens to me all the time.
Yeah. Like, it's a little frustrating, but it's also like nice to know that
it's nice to know you're on the right path. Yeah. And the thing
like,
with that is the other thing with that is like once you meet the level of society or the level of the current knowledge, you can keep pushing forward because you've developed all the understandings yourself, whereas other people are still waiting for someone to push it forward. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what I actually initially called this was semantic lattices, but it's called prototype classes in the literature. So what are prototype classes? The way I do this is basically I just use like a word cloud of words or action words that correspond closely but not exactly to the concept of each of the animals, right? And then we use a neural network basically to optimize that vector space. So
there's a girl in the community that actually did that. She had word clouds for everything.
Well, I was gonna initially use that. And
did you see that?
Yeah, I did see it.
Nice, cool. Okay.
I was like, oh wow, like a lot of the stuff people, I don't know.
Right.
I felt like a lot of building blocks was right there, which is really fun. But basically, what is a vector space? Semantic vector space. Let's go into that. Yeah. So a semantic vector space is basically where each sort of kind of point or point on that vector space, or each of
you don't necessarily know how many dimensions the vector space has, but all of the concepts sort of loosely relate within this space, and it creates some kind of geometric geometric shape within that space, sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's like a hyperdimensional vector space, like for word to vec, I think it's, I forget exactly what it was, but it's about as many words as there are in the vocabulary for some of those models. But the vector space and embedding space that's generated from other newer models like transformers, which also create embedding spaces, is a bit different. It's not, you can't really I'm not sure if you can say exactly, I guess you could, but basically each sort of dimension of that vector space corresponds to, you can think of it as like a trait or a aspect of that concept. So if you have tiger,
this for me just completely links to categorical thinking. It's how our minds work and link categories together.
Exactly. If you have like tiger and lion next to each other, the dimensions that where it would be the same in that vector space might be like cat,
mammals, cat,
mammal, cat,
large
size,
exactly,
shape or whatever. And then the places where it would be different would be the sort of concepts where it changes, which would be stripes, like one.
So that's exactly how I developed as well binary cognitive mechanics, and how we're doing stuff now in that domain by looking at just the space of the Jungian functions and seeing how they interrelate and how they overlap and how they differ. So you're doing this is what they're doing with the language models.
And it's very interesting stuff, because when you think of minimizing perplexity, if we think of our going back to that statistical model or that internal representation, if we think of that as a semantic network or a vector space, embedding space, when you're trying to minimize perplexity, you're trying to actually get it more clustered together. Like you're trying to have more dense connections, basically. And if you're trying to increase the perplexity, you're trying to increase the breadth of those connections. You're trying to make it more spread out. Because if it's more spread out, it could connect to more concepts, but not
Right,
as
but it wouldn't have the power. Yeah.
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 It's more
Have you ever
clustered.
looked at something called Newton's fractal?
Yeah, I have, like, when I was interested in fractals.
Okay, yeah. So what ends up happening is, okay, so it's like you have a map like this, right?
Yeah.
And then over iterations, it starts converging onto a concept to a point or whatever.
Yeah.
Like in this analogy, and so, but like what ends up happening is on the border, you don't know where it's going to end up. Like you end up with a very strong fractal on the border between concepts. And so like some of this stuff might end up way far away and stuff like that. And for me, that was like so true about how our minds work on concept. Is like on these borders, sometimes you don't know where it's going to end up. Yeah.
Yeah. That's true.
Anyways.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, larger breadth, you're more likely to connect to concepts, like different concepts, which you can think of as like any, right? Like they're more likely to find.
Yeah, the way you've defined it here, it looks like any. Yeah, it's connections between concepts. Yeah.
And then NI would be more clustered. So it might not be able to engage with a larger breadth of concepts, but each concept it does connect with, it will have a lot of connections and dense connections to it.
Well, to take the cat example, right? So abstracting from a kitten, tiger, all this stuff will all abstract. The one thing in common that all of this stuff will have is some kind of feline, right?
Yeah.
And so then that's the center part of it all. It's a conceptual center, not a sensory center. Yeah.
Exactly. And like if you think about it, like agents trying to minimize their perplexity, they're just trying to make this concept network or semantic network more clustered to develop an understanding of their reality. So that's kind of the idea there. So prototype classes. We're trying to basically optimize the vector space so then we can actually capture the idea of each animal. So for example, the word cloud, semantic vectors, the vectors that correspond to the concept of blast is going to be like, once we get some training data, we get some labeled data basically, and then if it gets to the right class, it will basically push and pull those vectors to cluster around the concept of blast. And that's kind of the idea here of these prototype classes. So that's just a way of getting a better inference of, is this word falling under this category or that category? So that's the idea of prototype classes. So how do I tie this into narratives? Basically, we use event-to-event predict. Like I'm working with an event-to-event prediction model. It's a transformer model, multi-head, that basically it's called circ event, where what they did here was basically there already are existing models that try to predict sequences of events. What this paper does is they try to add in circumstance. Does that improve how well it can predict sequences if you include the circumstance? Like Peter leaves home, and then Peter drives his car, and then Peter walks to the restaurant. What would come next?
Right.
But instead,
so if you have some kind of context or some kind of goal or something that unites, strings together the narrative.
Yeah, or like in each of those events in the event chain, like Peter leaves home, if you include the context or the circumstance behind Peter leaving home, that's more informative, right? It would tell you more, and they found that it improved
how well you predict better. Yeah,
improved how well you could predict the next event.
Right. If Peter's a serial killer and he's leaving home, it's probably different than if
he's be a little
more workaholic.
Yeah, exactly. He might not be going to work. He might be doing something more nefarious.
Right.
Is the idea. So the idea behind what I'm trying to do is I'm modifying this model basically to take in the prototype classes from before. So it'll take a value. It'll be like how close or how it's kind of a side, but do you remember that the diagram between like the animals, like OI, OE, and then DIDE, as like a kind of a, I forgot the word. How am I blanking on this? As the axis, basically, just like
Yeah, you showed it before.
Oh yeah. So in that axis, we're trying to just.
Sorry, I'm controlling your slides here.
Oh, good.
Here,
Yeah.
this one?
Yes, exactly. So I'm just trying to find a location on these axes that would correspond to for each
okay,
event.
so you're treating it as a space and less like a mode.
Exactly. And
okay.
each event should fall into that axis somewhere under this sort of overarching framework. And like there's a lot of things where it's like it doesn't easily lend itself to any of those event spaces, and that is something like
this is like you're interpreting things because like nothing's really trained on this. You have to train it again, right?
Exactly. I have to optimize the prototype classes, and the interesting thing about prototype classes is it can work in both a zero shot or a few shot, which means you don't need as much data to optimize those classes. So that's why,
because you already have the relationship between, like you already have this relationship here.
Yeah.
So you can get just a few good points.
Yeah.
Right.
And kind of.
Sorry.
It's all good. So I'm trying to add basically that dimension on those the two axes. I'm trying to add that as a feature in each of those event chains. So instead of just subject, action, object, circumstance, it'll be subject, action, object, circumstance, and the psychodynamic metric that we calculate.
Right. So like technically all of these words should already exist in that space, in like a higher space, but you're sort of collapsing it down onto our lower space and like mapping it out to our lower space.
Exactly.
So once you get a few key points, it's already mapped out, but now you kind of know where,
Exactly. And going back again, this is kind of like adding an inference of the changes of free energy into this prediction model. And adding an inference to the changes in free energy is where I tie into like, this is kind of getting the overt Lagrangian of behavior and tying that into the model and seeing if that improves performance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good call there. Yeah, I like that.
So how do we figure out how we transition between these states? So there's actually many and multiple.
Here you go. This looks just like control systems as well here, that diagram at the top. Yeah.
There's actually many different statistical models we can use. So there's dynamic Bayesian networks, there's recurrent neural networks, there's transformer models, there's hidden Markov, and there's Markov models. So the ones that I use specifically is just the regular Markov model. When I say what I use is we'll go into like simulations I've done where you can choose the personality of characters and then get like sort of simulations. This is separate from the narrative prediction, but it sort of ties in. So the Markov models, basically, it's just trying to determine how you transition between states. So what we do is it was kind of hard defining just an action as either blast or as just one animal. Instead, it was easier.
Sometimes there's multiple animals, yeah.
Exactly. It was easier to do one information and one energy animal. So blast play, blast sleep, consume play, consume sleep.
So pairs of animals are behaviors.
Yeah. Pairs of animals we can map onto a behavior. And then you can I give two examples that are kind of opposite on the spectrum.
I mean, that's kind of the same as just saying DE, DI, OE, OI as well.
It is. It was just easier for the semantic vector space because, and actually it is two different inferences. So it is doing DI, DE, and then it is doing that technically in the code. But kind of the idea here is, so when I say BPSC, I need to note this isn't the actual definition of BPSC in OPS because it's a little different. I just use it as a shorthand. It was easier than writing out BP to CP to BS to CS. But basically, you would expect this person to be more extroverted, action-oriented, communicative, and energetic. And if you look at their transition matrix, the states that are more extroverted, action-oriented, communicative, and energetic are the ones with higher probabilities. So it's more like leaning and skewed towards that side. So this agent that uses this transition matrix as their personality
Right.
type.
So you're coming with a model, everyone does everything, just in different
Everyone
probabilities.
does, and yes, exactly. It's a probability distribution of
rather than a time distribution.
yes.
Yeah.
And
so one day this blast play guy can do all sleep. You have no idea.
Yeah, that is like technically in the probability space of that
Right.
person. And what I found is there's actually it makes like an obscene amount of personality typologies with these transition matrix, like close to 1.5 million different typologies that you can make.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
just based on
where do those numbers come from? Oh, well, just the different percentages.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Not just like specific percentages, but different orderings, preferences of how you transition.
Right.
Well, 1.5 million, I think that comes if you include temperaments into each of these animals. Because then you would have like, I believe, what is that, like 16, and then each of them can transition in a different order.
Right.
So, like
permutation.
So yeah, and then on the other
someone who's a DE lead and then play consume, for example.
Yeah. Right. And then when I say 1.5 million typologies, it's like on a spectrum. So it's a spectrum.
It's completely on the spectrum. Yeah. Yeah.
Like you can have different.
So there's still the exact. I guess you have. How many did you have here? Like 64 types.
Well,
on a binary, but on a spectrum, it's way more.
Yeah. So it's kind of a spectrum, but it's like also there is a spectrum within that spectrum. Okay. So basically it's how they transition between each of these pairs. Those different orderings of how they transition, you can get an obscene amount of permutations, basically. Right. Distinct permutations.
Right.
That's the idea.
And you're talking again the probability of transitions.
Yeah. So like when I say a distinct permutation, all that really means is that it's greater or less in a certain aspect. So like the ones that are more likely to be in BP are all part of like the ones that are like, you can change these numbers, but as long as you're not making the relative like
the relative one is greater than the other. Yeah.
Then it's not technically a different typology in my book. But
that's right.
You
and
can
still get that many. Wow.
You still get that many, which is what's remarkable. Because within each, you can have a continuous amount of variation of each typology, but the sheer amount of typologies you get just from having these transition states is.
Do you think all of these typologies would map onto humans, or are there some that are just kind of illegal on humans? Like, because like I know objective personality says sleep play is illegal; it's an illegal move.
So yeah, that's the one thing where I was discussing this with people, and they were like, "Well, this includes people who are like perfectly balanced, right?" And that's true. Right. It does include people who are perfectly balanced. Right. So this is kind of supposed to be holistic.
That's right. Yeah,
with the mind.
And I guess like even the human population should have technically perfectly balanced people, but just at a lower probability.
Exactly. Like
or growth, someone who has a lot of growth to get there.
Yeah. Like the idea behind like Jungian psych and OPS with these typologies that map there is that everyone's going through the hero's journey in a similar sort of way where everyone has insecurities, everyone is hypercritical, everyone's like doing all these things. But I acknowledge that, and I do tend to agree with that. But I do also think that if you're just trying to like, so the cool thing about these transition matrices is if you observe someone's actions over time, you can create a transition matrix for them.
For them, okay. But it's not actually going to be them. It's just like based on you assessing the probabilities.
Based on, what I'm assessing. Over enough time, however, it would be a good model of their mind and behavior. Not just their behavior, their mind itself. Because you're kind of getting an inference on how the information is changing.
If this model is accurate, like with AI, we know how their mind is working because you've programmed their mind, right? Exactly. But with humanity, it's different because we don't. Much harder. Yeah. It's a model of the mind, and we can
So, what does this kind of lead to? It's like you can make transition matrices or personality typologies just from observing people. You can what I end up doing is I hard code these personality typologies and use it as personality types that you can put into simulations here,
There you
where
go. Yeah.
I have each character and I give them a transition matrix, and then basically it breaks
You get a
down
different
this.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, you get a different story each time. It's going event by event in the story.
And based on what you're saying, even if you have the same matrix, you get a different story every time because it's a probability based. Right?
Exactly. And but when you read the stories, you can actually see, oh, this would be something someone who's more action-oriented, extroverted, communicative, and energetic would do. This is something that someone more introspective and open-minded and curious and lower energy would do, just from picking the different personality typologies.
Right.
This,
and again, is you didn't program this based on personality typologies. You programmed this based on entropy, based on and based on associations of behaviors.
Exactly. And for this specifically, like we do use those prototype classes, so it is a little different than how
it's a little circular. That's right.
A little circular, yeah, because we are using language.
Right.
But it is instead of just using. That's why I still think this is an improvement over trait-based predictions, because there is no data currently of how you would like
interpret them, like match them, right? So
yeah,
from
like,
model to
like if you have
trait.
an action, how does that map onto the trait-based measures? No one really
knows.
But there's a very clear-cut association between actions and this framework.
That's right. You can always map it as some kind of like, is it this kind of animal for something else? It's like, is it reducing entropy externally? Is it increasing entropy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing. And the thing about like being able to make transition matrices from observations of people, you can, if you observe someone for long enough and you have their transition matrix and you put them as like, you put their name and then you put their personality, it's a better prediction than just nothing of what that person would do.
Yeah.
It's not going to be exact, but it's a better prediction.
Right. And so then you get the surprise, the perplexity there. You can actually predict what people are doing.
Yeah. And like you could predict what they would do in a different context or scenario. And with the story generator that I just made to test this out, you can enter any context you want and you'll be able to see what happens. And
the other thing is like humans generally repeat things that work.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they find a solution to something, they will repeat that solution. They don't have to reevaluate it.
Yeah.
Whereas, and if you know something isn't working, you know they're going to try to find a different solution, and it'll be based on that animal order. So the next solution they'll try will do something like that. And so you can kind of, you need that to predict behavior as well, I guess. Past behaviors that like work are getting reinforced. Yeah. Then, you know.
So that's actually an interesting point you made there, is why I hit it. Like that's kind of the deficit of Markov models. So there's like this Markov assumption that the states prior to just like the one right before it doesn't really have an effect on it. This is useful if you're trying to make a personality that has like similar behavior kind of statically. But if you're trying to find out how behavior changes over time, so like
the Markov will fail, It's just random constantly.
Yeah. Like if I was trying to use,
so it's good for an initial mapping of it, I guess.
Yeah. It's actually, if you're trying to do something like The Sims, right, where you want the personalities to more or less be consistent, a Markov model would be really useful. But if you're trying to find out how personalities will change over a specific narrative where there's like an exposition, a climax, and a resolution, the behaviors patterns
like
are going to
growth,
change.
For example. Yeah.
Because
like that's the whole thing with growth is we just keep doing the same thing until we fail, until we have enough tidal waves, until there's enough external pressure, then we'll try something new.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to model growth, and like at least in the context of a closed narrative, if you're trying to do an open narrative story world, kind of like this, honestly,
here, when we're on this screen, just really quickly, so you see Bob on the left side. In the left story is blast, play, sleep, consume, and on the right side he's consume, sleep, blast, play. Yeah. So just so you,
the
Bob
names
changes from narrative to narrative.
The names aren't fixed.
Right.
I forgot. I didn't see the last thing that.
Oh yeah, no, he just wants to know. He
Oh,
did. I don't think he saw the top part there. What the
okay.
characters are, their personality types. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, um, a Markov model will be useful for like I honestly think of these as generative story worlds because you can interact with the characters, and
Right.
I think of their Markov model as their minds basically. And
Can you throw them into situations yet?
yeah, you can throw
Yeah.
them in any situation you like.
So you can make one a wizard and throw a dragon at it.
Yeah, and just add that as the only text I added was Bob enters the apartment for both.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
I could change that. Sometimes I did Bob enters a warehouse, or I do a different name, or I just do put a single word. Like it doesn't really. That's
Right.
not really the aspect.
It predicts the next word in the. It's like a
Yeah,
language
yeah.
model. Yeah.
Well, it predicts event sequences, and then
Right.
those event sequences, I have a lot of code that like makes it into a cohesive narrative. So there's
Right.
like a lot of actual intricate parts that came into this, but
Cool.
yeah. So yeah, Markov models not very useful if you're trying to have like growth, but if you have a dynamic Bayesian network or a recurrent neural network or even a transformer model, it could map and model growth and changes in behavior because it takes into account time. So like the timestamp of the beginning of a story, the behaviors might be different. End of a story, behaviors might be different in that
Yes,
aspect.
so many of our narratives are people who just got used to one environment and they thrust in a new environment and see how you grow. Good luck.
Exactly.
And then always the contrast at the end of the narrative is, hey, let's throw you back into your original environment and see how you've changed.
Exactly. And like you need to model that growth for like that story structure. So yeah, generative story worlds there. So kind of this slide was basically just how we simulate using computational psychodynamics. Now going back to circ event, this is how we validate the use of computational psychodynamics. So the only way you can kind of validate generative story worlds is if you have human evaluators, and there's a few other ways you can like kind of objectively validate this.
And you're talking about this like in comparison to other models or just independent of itself?
In comparison to other models.
Right.
So kind of that is an analysis I'm thinking of doing for the paper, but when I'm trying to really push this into academia, I need like a very objective and like way of validating the improvement of narrative generation using these prototype classes. So to do that, like I said previously, we're trying to modify circ event, which is this event to event prediction model. Instead of subject, action, object, circumstance, it's subject, action, object, and then the information behavior type similarity, and then the energy behavior type similarity, and seeing if that improves compared to other baselines. So there's actually a way of just measuring the accuracy. In the picture right here with the different models and the accuracy scores, they were able to objectively show on the specific MCNC test set that, which is used widely for a lot of these sequence prediction models, how the accuracy improves in different architectures. So with the circ event architecture where they add circumstance, they had a remarkable improvement of 84.6 compared to like the closest thing before that was 72.4.
So whose model is this, the 84.6?
That's circ event where they just add subject, action, object, and circumstance. Right. So just adding circumstance alone, 84.6. What I'm hoping to do and what I'm currently doing right now, and I think we're pretty close, is just like a lot of fine tuning and stuff. But basically, I modified the architecture to basically include the psychometrics information, and we're trying to see, will this improve the accuracy beyond 84.6? Because if it does, important thing to note.
You just dominated it. Yeah. You just showed that you have something. Yeah.
Show that we have something. It's like actually in the human consciousness, because when people are writing stories, they're taking this into account. It's kind of the idea behind the circ event. And this is also the idea behind what I'm trying to do here as well. So I'm going to compare this with not just the classes that I pick. I'm going to use different classes, because what if just adding that additional information, what if that just like is essentially overfitting that's kind of something we have to like look at.
Okay. Yeah, good luck. That sounds like a challenge. It sounds like yeah. I hope you do well. I mean, even getting to anywhere like above 70, it looks like it's decent for you guys.
Yeah.
And you can improve from there. Yeah.
What I'm trying to do is, so I'm going to compare that with other baselines and different classifications. So like one of the control classifications I was using was just like physical actions and emotional or social actions and things like that, where in theory, I want this to be improved over all other classification categories or controls that I use.
I mean, technically, you could also work all of the coins. Like you can look at like feeling versus thinking and do word clouds there, and intuition versus sensing and do word clouds there. And
we actually are, we do have something like that. Like someone who was helping me out a little bit, Lamar McNeil, he made like word clouds for each of the temperaments and subdivisions of the temperaments as well. And we're thinking,
all you really have to do is binaries in essence.
Exactly, binaries, and you can add that information. So in order to deal with the fact that like maybe just adding any binary would like improve it in fake sense overfitting.
Right. That's right.
We have to 100%. Compare it with controls, and we have to do some validation to make sure that it's not overfitting. And so those are all the kind of things that go into like really getting this into academia, getting OPS and all of this into academia. We have to do all of this to like make sure that we can actually validate it objectively. And from what I was looking into, like aside from just modeling it and simulating it, kind of this is just my way of trying to validate it.
So yeah, what we were talking about before was that how this isn't actually trying to prove OPS or anything like that. It's trying to show that it's useful, which is very different than proving it. It's proving its utility, that it has utility.
Yeah. It's like one look at, it's proving that it's useful, but it's also seeing that like, are we using this when we're writing? That's what this would actually show, is are we using this when we're writing? When it comes
subconsciously, to OPS, subconscious writers, are they?
When it comes to proving OPS, I feel like just the fact that you can map this onto active inference is proof enough, because active inference is already
it's proof enough that of its functionality.
That's right. Active inference is already out there, and
you got to it through here.
So like it's kind of already connected to something that's validated, and I think that's why in the paper I try introducing active inference, introducing Jungian psych, because I want people to see that basically all this knowledge from 50 years of cognitive science in the beginning,
you just develop like that on your own.
Like we cut ourselves off from all of this knowledge, and then we're trying to redevelop all of this, when I'm just showing that all of that knowledge was pretty much already there to an extent, and we were actually noticing it before. And this is how it all maps up very mathematically, very scientifically. So I believe that was the last of them.
Nice. Really nice.
Just a question slide.
I mean, I've been asking you questions the whole time. I don't know.
So
here, let me just share this one really quick. Let me just play this out. So this is kind of what I was talking about with the Newton's fractal. Let's jump forward. So like this is exactly those 3 domains that you had before, and you can do it with many more domains. But it's like what happens if you zoom in on, like you could just keep zooming in forever on the center, right? I don't know if it zooms somewhere else eventually. Oh yeah, it does. It zoomed in on something else here. No, it just keeps zooming on the center. But anyways, you can find all kinds of other different fractals in there. Like the Mandelbrot set is in the Newton's fractal, for example. It's pretty crazy. But it's I don't know. Anyways, I just wanted to share that. Sorry.
Well, that actually got me thinking of something interesting. There was this paper by a physicist about his interpretation of what life was in a physics sense. He thought of it as low entropy eddies, basically. So like a spiral, or like in laminar flow, when you see like
the eddies,
spirals, eddies of like low entropy, they're actually there to increase the entropy of the overall system.
Right. They increase it faster. The rate of entropy. Yeah.
Increase it faster. So in a way, life is through
life is doing that. That's right. Yeah.
It kind of aligns with that.
Stars are doing that on their own.
Yeah.
Life is doing that. Yeah.
So honestly, like seeing us as kind of like those spirals and like a plume of smoke, like for the longest time, whenever I saw that, I would always be like, oh, that's kind of what we're doing.
So this is Lau. He's a guy in the community who's working on group theory stuff. So could you use this to also classify story types on a spectrum of how much they fit OPS?
Yeah. So I'm not sure about how much they fit OPS, but having like these story archetypes and things like that would be actually something that people who I presented this to in my in the psych graduate department in University of Illinois were very interested in. They wanted to know like the different like story structures and things like that.
I mean, eventually I could see how an AI could, narrow in on a type to recreate Harry Potter, for example.
Yeah. Like if you have the personality types of the characters, completely, a lot of like generative story worlds and things like that, that's like the most important part. You keep the setting consistent, keep the other things, and then like kind of my imagination gets out there. It's just kind of like I imagine that in the future people will use this to basically create these generative story worlds in VR or whatever, and then just interact with their own story. Like if you want to be in the Harry Potter universe, this
you have to have a backstory for everybody, like a context.
You need their personalities and their minds modeled.
Like a millennial child is going to be very different in Moby Dick than someone of that epic, right? Yeah.
And if you have their minds modeled and the story structure, or well, at least the setting of the world and stuff, they can generate their own story that corresponds to the characters and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that'd be really cool. It's like generate a new episode of Star Wars, please.
Yeah, like imagine if you could just people eventually just live in the Star Wars world, and
oh god, that's scary. Yeah, people could get stuck there.
like getting Black Mirror-esque, but
Black Mirror-esque, yeah, for sure.
But yeah,
cool. Well, Ajith, like this is really exciting that you're doing this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a big risk, I think, on your academic career as well if this doesn't pan out completely.
I mean, I'm doing other stuff too, thankfully. But
yeah, no, I hope this pans out for you, and like I really appreciate you coming out here and sharing it with us. And taking us along with where you're at this moment. And I can see that you're going somewhere with this. You have goals, you have aims. You're the one pushing for this. You're like this one-man army at the moment, and like I hope people join you. I hope you have success and people end up joining you and helping you out. So too. Yeah. For the meantime, what is there anything you want from the community? Can anyone help you out in some way?
Yeah, so we have a Discord community where we discuss AI, all of this like NT stuff basically behind all of this, and having like engagement there is very helpful. But also if anyone is interested in like working with me on this, feel free to message me and reach out because
I put your email already. You asked me to, right? That's okay.
So just email me and we can figure something out because I'm always
send them good pyramid schemes too if you want.
Yep.
Just kidding. No, don't do that. Don't bother Ajith. Yeah. Cool. I hope the community harassing you actually helps you. It doesn't actually distract from your work, but
So I love engaging with the community. I love engaging with all these people who are interested. I find that they're very passionate, and it's definitely very interesting. Like we definitely can use input from basically everyone in different domains. This is very interdisciplinary research. So
yeah. I mean, you started out in computer science and now you're in cognitive psychology. That's kind of weird.
Like computer science and Yeah.
Cool. Well, really, really grateful to have you out, and hopefully we'll get you back once you have some more developments to share. Keep me in the loop. Yeah.
Thank you for meeting with me.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stick around for a second.